If you care about serious history, if you care about how ordinary people endured extraordinary pressure, then you already understand why January 1943 matters. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, because what we do here is preserve practical historical knowledge that's disappearing fast, and this episode is exactly that kind of material. In early 1943, the war had tightened its grip. Shipping lanes were under attack, ration books dictated daily life, and governments quietly acknowledged a truth civilians had to face head-on. Survival at home depended on the soil under your feet. Today I'm going to walk you through what crops mattered most, why they were chosen, and how people actually applied this knowledge under wartime constraints. This is not nostalgia, this is applied history, and it still works. Why? January 1943 forced a different way of thinking about food. By January 1943, self-sufficiency was no longer optional. In Britain, imports were still vulnerable to U-boat attacks. In the United States, food production was being redirected to feed troops and allies. Across Europe, occupation and labor shortages crippled commercial agriculture. Governments promoted home growing through programs like Victory Gardens, but the real responsibility fell on households. Winter planning mattered because seeds chosen in January determined calories available months later. The guiding principle was simple and brutal: grow crops that delivered the most nutrition, stored well, and tolerated poor conditions. Potatoes were the backbone of wartime calories. Potatoes were not a romantic choice, but they were indispensable. They produced more calories per square meter than almost any other crop available to civilians. In 1943, people planted them knowing they could survive cool soils, resist short-term neglect, and be harvested gradually. A family with even a modest plot could meet a significant portion of its calorie needs through potatoes alone. Practically, growers favored seed potatoes saved from the previous harvest, cutting them carefully so each piece carried an eye, then chitting them indoors near windows to get a head start before planting as soon as soil could be worked. Cabbage and brassicas sustained families through winter and spring. Cabbage, kale, and other brassicas filled a different but equally critical role. They were hardy, vitamin-rich, and capable of staying in the ground long after other crops failed. Wartime planners understood scurvy was a real risk when fresh imports vanished, so leafy greens became essential. Families staggered planting times, so some heads matured early while others overwintered. A practical method was to plant cabbage in succession every few weeks, ensuring a continuous supply rather than a single glut that spoiled before it could be eaten. Beans and peas. Oh, they were a real lifesaver when meat was scarce. Protein shortages, they really defined those wartime diets. But dried beans and peas, they were the answer. They fixed nitrogen in the soil, improved future harvests, and could be dried and stored without refrigeration. In January of 1943, experienced growers, they selected varieties known for reliability rather than yield alone. Broad beans, they went into the cold soil early, while peas followed just a bit later. Once harvested, pods were left to dry fully before shelling. Families, they learned to rotate them with potatoes in meals to stretch both crops further. Quite the strategy, really. Carrots and root crops, they really extended food security beyond the harvest season. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips, they were valued not just for their nutrition but for their storage potential too. In wartime, Britain especially, carrots became symbolic of endurance because they could remain in the ground until needed. Practical storage methods included clamping, which meant layering roots with straw and soil outdoors to protect them from frost. This allowed families to draw food well into winter without relying on scarce fuel for preservation. Quite a clever solution, wasn't it? Onions and leeks formed the flavor base of survival cooking. You know, onions and leeks rarely get credit in survival discussions, but in 1943 they were critical. They stored well, resisted disease, and transformed bland staples into tolerable meals. Onions planted from sets in early spring matured reliably even in poor soils. Families braided cured onions and hung them in cool sheds, ensuring months of supply. This mattered psychologically as much as nutritionally because morale depended on meals that felt familiar. Applying 1943 lessons to real-world growing today. What made wartime growing effective was discipline and planning, not technology. Households tracked planting dates, saved seed whenever possible, and reused composted waste to maintain soil fertility. Even today, you can apply these same principles by prioritizing calorie-dense crops, staggering harvests, and learning basic storage methods. A small modern garden managed with 1943 logic can still provide remarkable resilience against disruption. Why this knowledge still matters? January 1943 teaches us that food security is fragile and local solutions matter. People did not wait for relief. They adapted. They planted what worked, accepted limitations, and shared knowledge within their communities. That mindset is as valuable now as it was then. If you found this useful, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who values real history, and keep this knowledge alive. This is the legacy of survival, and it only survives if we pass it on.